Hello and welcome back to another NHL 101 or Hockey for Beginners video. And no, I am very clearly not Snoop Dogg, but in that particular series of NHL 101 videos, they didn't quite get to everything, so I figured I'd fill in some of the gaps. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then definitely go ahead and look those up because they are pretty fantastic videos. But maybe wait until after this one. But regardless, in this particular episode of my series of NHL 101 videos, we're going to be talking about the standard stats that are recorded for every player in every game at the NHL level. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, there's a handy little subscribe button down there that can probably help you out. Now, before we get too far into it, I do want to say once again, these are going to be the standard stats, so if you're looking more for the advanced stats, that's probably going to be a different video down the road. And we're going to start with pretty much the most basic and most important stat of them all: goals. Now, when it comes to what constitutes a goal and how players get them, well, that's actually pretty straightforward, which is not a trait of this particular stat that it shares with very many others in the sport, as you'll come to see. In order for a player to get a goal, they need to be the last player on their team to touch the puck before it goes into the opposing team's net, by the puck going all the way over the line. So it's pretty straightforward most of the time. There are a couple of ways that goals can get called back, but we're going to go into that probably in a different video, so for now, we're just going to stick with that basic definition. Now again, the most important thing here is being the last player to touch the puck before it goes into the goal. So if you were to shoot a puck and it goes directly into the goal, then it's pretty simple, it's your goal. If you hit the puck and it goes off an opposing player, or an opposing player were to knock it in after you were the last one to touch it, then you still get the goal. But if you were to shoot a puck and it were to be deflected by or go off of one of your teammates, then that would be your teammate's goal because they were the last one to touch it. Which is a strategy that's pretty widely used across hockey because it does make it much harder for the goalie to track where the puck is going to be. Now, when it comes to tracking goals as a stat and looking at them over the course of a season, some potential benchmarks to look at least as far as this particular era of hockey is concerned, is that 50 goals is a very, very good season. That's something that only one or two players will manage to achieve in each year, assuming one even gets there, which does pretty much require a full season, which again, we haven't had in a couple of years now. 40 plus goals is also still a very, very good season, and although a handful of players will get there every year, it's not something that every fan base is going to see every year. 30 plus is still a pretty good season for most players, and 20 plus is still a pretty good season for guys that are not going to be the primary goal scorers on a team. Now, those particular benchmarks do pretty much only apply to forwards who will be doing the majority of the scoring. On the defensive end, 20 is pretty much that high water mark where only a few defenders will reach that in a given season. And then 15 plus to 10 plus are still very good to pretty good seasons for a defender when it comes to scoring goals. And when it comes to records, well, the single season record for goals is 92, set by Wayne Gretzky, which is a record that is not going to be touched anytime soon. Not only was that Wayne Gretzky, but it was also a very different era with a lot more scoring. And as far as career goals are concerned, well, once again, that's going to be a record owned by Wayne Gretzky with 894 career goals. The only other player to even reach 800 career goals was Gordie Howe with 801. So it is definitely going to be pretty hard for anybody to ever reach Gretzky's career goal record, especially with the NHL set up the way it is currently. But if somebody was going to catch it, it would have to be somebody like Alexander Ovechkin, for example, who scores goals at a pretty ridiculous rate. He is also the leading career goal scorer as far as active players are concerned, with 711 as of the recording of this video, and is one of only two active players who are in the top 50 in career goals, with the other being Patrick Marleau. But that being said, with his 466 career goals, Sidney Crosby is definitely likely to crack that top 50 in the next year or two. Moving on from goals though, that brings us to the second most important stat when it comes to putting points on the board, and that is assists. Now, at a basic level, an assist is pretty straightforward. It's just the player who passes the puck to the player that scores the goal, or in the NHL's case, up to the last two people to touch the puck before the goal scorer. But not every goal gets an assist, so in the end, a goal can have 0, 1, or 2 people assisting on it. And when it comes to how that's determined, well, that's where things start to get a little bit more fuzzy. Every game has its own scorekeeper for the NHL. And while there are guidelines for what counts as an assist, and at least at the NHL level, the people that keep the score do a pretty good job of staying fairly uniform to what each person is counting, there still is a certain level of subjectivity to it that does lead to some things getting counted as an assist in one place that would not necessarily count as an assist in another. There are some places and some nights where the scorekeeper seems to be giving out assists like they're cars on an Oprah Winfrey show. And then there's other nights where they're a little bit more stingy. But again, at least at the NHL level, they do a pretty good job of being fairly uniform in what counts. Most of the time anyway. And when it comes to season benchmarks, once again, forwards tend to get a little bit more assists than defensemen, but this is much more even between the two. 70 is a benchmark that probably only forwards will meet, and there's probably only going to be a couple of guys that do get to 70 each year, if anybody does. 60, a handful of guys will get to, and again, it's probably going to be mostly forwards with maybe one defenseman, and then 50, 40, and 30 are all still pretty good seasons for assists, and as you get farther and farther down, more and more defensemen will start to get into the mix. And when it comes to the all-time leaders in career assists, well, let's just say the name at the top of that list is gonna look pretty familiar. Yep, it's Wayne Gretzky again with 1,963 career assists, which if his goals record does end up falling one day, this is one that probably will not. And I can say that with a fair amount of confidence for a couple of reasons. One being that second place on that career assists list is at 1,249, although it is a name that Seattle fans will probably recognize because it is our current GM, Ron Francis. And the other and most important reason, at least as long as we're in this current era of NHL hockey is concerned, is because the current leader in active assists is Sidney Crosby with 806. He's also the only player that's currently active who is in the top 50 in career assists. And while Sidney Crosby is still absolutely an all-time great player, and that is a very good stat for him, it still means that at this rate, he would have to play for 39 seasons before he would be able to reach Gretzky's record, which does seem pretty unlikely. And the third stat that you'll probably hear brought up most often by announcers, or maybe that friend that finally convinced you to get into hockey, is points. And while the name of points might be a little bit misleading at first, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a player's goals plus their assists. And when it comes to points, although once again because of the discrepancy in number of goals scored, forwards are going to be dominating this, 100 points is pretty much the benchmark of a truly great season, with 80 or 90 points or really even 70 still being very good seasons. And of course, because it is just the previous two stats added up, it should come as no surprise that the career leader in that is once again Wayne Gretzky, with his 2,857 career points being nearly 1,000 more than the 1,921 points of Jaromir Jagr, who is at second on that list. And as far as active players are concerned, only Sidney Crosby and Alexander Ovechkin have been able to crack 1,200 to this point in their careers, at 35th and 37th on the list, with Patrick Marleau 50th on the list for career points. And when it comes to measuring how good a player is, while points are probably the best standard or more basic stat for that because, once again, scoring goals and scoring points is how you win games, it still definitely is far from perfect because, well, for one, it says that goals and assists are basically just as good as each other, and for another, it basically says that forwards are way better than defensemen because they're the ones that get more points. But even if the point stat isn't a perfect depiction of the talent of a player, it still is considerably better than another stat that has been around for a while, even if it is starting to go the way of the landline. And that is plus minus, which I pretty much am only bringing up because it is another one of the standard stats that you're likely to hear people talking about, at least for the next few years anyway. Now, I guess one potential upside for plus minus is that it is pretty simple. A player gets a plus if they're on the ice when a goal is scored for their team, and they get a minus if a goal is scored against them while they're on the ice. Now, there are a couple of exceptions for this. For example, a power play goal doesn't count for pluses or minuses for either player, although a shorthanded goal does. And then shootout goals also don't count for plus minus. And again, since you're probably watching this because you're new to hockey, as a reminder, the power play is when a team has a man advantage because the other team has somebody in the penalty box. So again, if the team with more players on the ice scores a goal, nobody gets a plus or a minus, but if the team with fewer people on the ice because one of their guys is in the penalty box, if they score a goal, then everybody does get a plus and a minus according to which team they're on. Now, to go on a little bit of a tangent, this whole era of stats-based analytics in sports was largely spurred on by baseball. And while stats can be very useful for finding those underrated players to bring more value to your team, which is the whole point of Moneyball, in baseball they are a lot easier to use because in that sport, pretty much everything is an isolated incident. It's a pitcher and a batter in a one-on-one scenario, or one of the guys in the field collecting the ball in one way or another and throwing it to another player. The point is there's just not a whole lot of interaction between players. But in other sports like hockey, basketball, and football, things get a lot more complicated when it comes to using stats to track a player's ability. Because unlike in baseball, where for most part players are pretty isolated and each incident is pretty isolated, in those sports, things are much more free-flowing and everything is different because it can be affected by the other players on the field at any given moment. Which is all just to say that while stats are very important and even to this point have absolutely made a positive difference in talent evaluation, they still should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, especially in a free-flowing sport like hockey. So then, to bring it back to where we were with plus minus, part of that statistical revolution is the fact that over time, stats are going to evolve and some old stats might start to show some of their weaknesses. And in this particular case, let's just say that plus minus is about as useless of a stat as wins are for a pitcher in baseball. It still does, I guess, in some cases potentially have its uses and can show maybe general trends, at least as far as myself and many others are concerned. At this point, its pluses tend to get outweighed by, well, it's minuses. But I'm probably not going to get too much more into that now, that it's probably a different video for another time. So if you are more curious about that right now, well, let's just say there's no shortage of opinions on the internet if you just do a quick search. Another stat though that while it does have its problems is definitely useful, and to be fair, its problems are more along the lines of the problems with assists, is shots on goal. Again, this is a stat that tends to be a little bit subjective as to what counts as a shot on goal depending on who's keeping the score, but in general, this is a shot that the scorekeeper thinks would have gone in the goal if the goalie wasn't there. So if a player takes a shot and it misses the goal entirely, or goes off of one of the crossbars, or is blocked by one of the defensemen, then it doesn't count as a shot on goal. This is a stat that tends to be used to more kind of show the trend of a game and which team has been controlling most of the action and getting most of the shots and most of the offensive opportunities. Of course, again, it's not necessarily perfect for that because of one, the subjectivity, and also because, well, not all players are as accurate at shooting at the goal as others. Some other stats that you might see include PIM, which stands for penalties in minutes. This is how much time a player spends in the penalty box, which I guess you can see is either a good thing or a bad thing. Some people tend to like it because it shows a player is a little bit more gritty, and other people realize that this is time that that person is putting their team at a disadvantage. In the end, though, it is fair to say that while most of the time taking a penalty is not necessarily a good thing, there are some times where it can be helpful. But if there's anything you'll see hockey fans arguing about, it's what a good penalty is. So I'm just not going to touch that right now. Going back to the shots on goal real quick, shooting percentage is another one you might see. This is pretty simply just the number of shots that turn into goals. ATOI, which stands for average time on ice, is another one that you might see on a player's stat line, and one that I've used in my expansion draft videos. Pretty simply, this is just the average amount of time a player spends on the ice during a game. This is also a stat that because there are fewer defensemen and they do less skating, defensemen tend to have much bigger numbers in than forwards. Faceoff percentage, again, is pretty straightforward. This is the number of faceoffs that a player wins, which this is a stat that not every player is even going to take faceoffs, so it really only applies to the main guys that are taking faceoffs for any given team. And just in case you don't know what a faceoff is, that's when the referee drops the puck for two guys, one from either team, to fight over control of, which you'll see at the start of every period, and then also some other times during the game. Now, if you do happen to be more into the toughness or defensive aspect of the game, these next two stats are going to be much more for you. We're going to start with blocked shots, which is definitely one that is ruled by defensemen. Again, somewhat up to the discretion of a scorekeeper as to what counts as a blocked shot. This is pretty much just when any skater gets in the way of a puck that's shot by the opposing team. So no, goalies don't count for this one. When it comes to some season benchmarks for block shots, every year you'll see a few guys get over the 200 mark. That's the handful of guys that thought they wanted to be goalies, but that goalies really just had too many pads for them. But really anything over 150 for a season is a pretty good number of block shots, and really anything over 100 is a lot of frozen rubber to have hitting your body over the course of a season. But such is the life of a defenseman, or I guess a penalty killing forward. But if you really want a stat about toughness that's fully dominated by the subjective opinion of the scorekeeper, then hits is the stat for you. Differing opinions between scorekeepers aside, hits are pretty simple. When a player hits another player, that's a hit, with the more hits a player lands over the course of the season determining just how physical that player tends to play, with 250 to 300 being usually the top end for one season. Now, it does have to be said that when it comes to your elite forwards and your main goal scorers, hits and especially block shots are probably not something you want to see them getting a whole lot of, unless of course they just happen to be really big like Alexander Ovechkin, in which case a few hits probably won't hurt. Well, won't hurt them anyway, it might hurt the other guy. Outside of that though, the only other more standard stats that you might see for skaters would probably be with their goals, assists, and points broken out over even strength, shorthanded, and power play goals, points, and assists. That being said though, there still are plenty of other stats, and then there's advanced stats, which again, I'll probably do a video on down the road, but for now, this is what we have. I was also going to include some goalie stats into this video, but I think it's starting to go kind of long, so I'm going to go ahead and save that for another video. So for now, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. If you have any questions about any of the stats I covered, or any that you might have seen that I didn't cover, feel free to ask me about those as well. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!